Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Rodrigo Arenas, CEO of República, Melanio Escobar, Executive Director of Redes Ayuda, Tamara Taraciuk, Acting Americas Director at Human Rights Watch.
Well, thank you. I have the pleasure today to introduce Mrs. Tamara Taraciuk, America's Acting Director of Human Rights Watch, and Melanio Escobar, periodista venezolano and director of Redes Ayuda. Today we have the honor, the privilege of speaking about something that is very, very important for every human being. And I think we don't know what we have until we lose it, which is freedom of speech and democracy. I believe in freedom of speech for everyone, without limits. But freedom of press comes with a responsibility. So today we can talk about two things: freedom of speech as a human right and freedom of press with accountability. And I'm saying this as the CEO of a media company and president of the Freedom of Speech Committee of the Guatemalan Chamber of Journalists. But we're able to discuss these issues usually in countries that still respect these rights. These freedoms and all God-given rights are usually enjoyable in democratic republics, like the ones we are right now. And this is what is very frightening. The majority of countries in the Americas are suffering democratic regression, most of them by socialist populist regimes supported by or acting as drug cartels, and some of them still deciding how radical they're going to become. But there are dangerous ideas and or bills all over the world, all over the continent, all over the Americas. The Peruvian ley Mordaza, for example, passing through Nicaragua and El Salvador up to the US with the Biden's Disinformation Governance Board, dubbed as the Ministry of Truth. And all of this while journalists are being killed and captured in Mexico, Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela, and all other countries. Some from governments, another from drug cartels. So we can definitely conclude that it is urgent to discuss how to address this humanitarian emergency we have in front of us. So for that, we have two experts, two persons originally both from Venezuela, one more Venezuelan than the other, I understand. But let's say Latin American citizens that are very, very engaged in the problematics that we're living. So I guess we need to discuss how to stop this. I'm not saying that we're going to be able to stop it in this conversation, but at least how we need to discuss it. So Tamara, I would leave you with the first engagement. Let us know what you think about it.
Thank you. Look, I think we need to put this in context. And I'm extremely concerned about the situation in Latin America right now. We have countries in the extreme where we have dictatorships like Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, where, when people take to the streets, they are met with repression and they can't exercise their freedom of speech. In Cuba, you have artists who can't sing because they get prosecuted and sent to jail. And this is not just about political opponents. It's about any citizen wanting to expose and express what is happening in their country. But it's not just those countries. We have a lot of countries in the region where you have democratically elected leaders that get to power through elections, and once they get to power, they just turn their back on basic democratic guarantees. And they turn their back on judicial independence, they turn their back on the ability of human rights defenders to do their work, and on the ability of independent journalists to do their work. And when you were talking about what can we do, I think the silver lining of this very dark scenario that I just described from our region is that you do have very brave people who are still doing the work that needs to be done to hold people accountable. And I think we have to recognize and highlight, of course, the work of independent journalists who are in brave contexts reporting and exposing what happens, the work of civil society groups, including in countries like Nicaragua, where more than 600 organizations were shut down in the past few months. And also the work of brave prosecutors and justice officials who continue to document and expose abuse and corruption in a region where that is a very, very difficult thing that we need to tackle. And I think that's something that we have to think about when talking about the freedom of exercising basic rights, including free speech.
Correct. Thank you. Melanio, you have an organization that is trying to help these journalists. What do you propose we do to stop all this?
One of the things that the first thing that we have to understand is that Latin America right now has the #1 rank on impunity against crimes against journalists. This is something really bad. This is something that is being allowed by governments. Even the ones that are called democratic are allowing this kind of killings, harassment, incarcerations of journalists without any justice served for them. So when you have that environment where journalists cannot do their work and free media is being persecuted by power like cartels or even governments, what can we do to help these journalists to conduct their work? Most of these journalists get to exile. They come here to the United States, like myself. But once you get here, you cannot do the work that you were used to do. So once you are in exile, you're being silenced. And that's the thing that governments like the US government has to address in a very forward way, because we don't have any mechanism to help journalists that have to escape from Venezuela, for example, to keep doing their work. Basically, once you leave Venezuela, you have to come here and work in whatever. So you are allowing the power to continue their human rights violations, their crimes, because you cannot expose them or you cannot tell the stories that you have to tell, because you are not allowed to travel, you're not allowed to work in the place that you have to escape from.
If I could add something to
Yes.
that, I think, obviously Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba are one different scenario. But when you think of countries like Mexico or Central America, another big problem in terms of journalists is, the very poor protection mechanisms that exist.
Yeah.
In Mexico, you have a protection mechanism that, there are cases in which people brought complaints to the mechanism and they got killed before the mechanism addressed the case. So, that I think is something that is worth investing, because you don't want to have exile as the only option. You need to support the work of journalists on the ground. And sometimes, as you said, the context is very, very dangerous.
But that's exactly what I believe is the problem. I think we have, let's say, two examples, Mexico and Nicaragua. In Nicaragua, you have a lot of government suppression, let's say, for journalists, a lot of violence against journalists from government, that's for sure. I don't know how much of drug money is behind it. But in Mexico are the drug cartels that are killing the journalists, more than the government. That's my feeling from the outside, or the information that I have from the outside. So the problem with all these mechanisms and the problem with all these protocols is that drug dealers, they don't really respect that. The only mechanism that you could have as a government to protect a journalist against being killed by a drug cartel would be bulletproof cars, bodyguards, something that would be impossible for a government to give 100 journalists to. So my question is, I think we have two huge different problems. One of them is these political leaders, populists, mostly populists, most of them socialists, some of them also right-wing, but populists at the end. But you have the drug cartels, stronger and stronger every time. I'm from Guatemala, and in Guatemala, the drug cartels are also making a lot of damage inside the country, in places that the government doesn't even have any presence. So how can we deal with this, with these two issues? Because one of them, as I'm telling you, is government ways. Okay, I think that's a lot easier. But Venezuela, for example, that is already like even named, Maduro is named as a drug cartel leader, I think we have a huge problem. And I'm gonna message, and my question maybe here is, what can the US, how much responsible is the US of this drug dealing in Latin America, because our drugs that are coming here to the US to be consumed here in the US, how much responsibility does the US has? And going back to yesterday's panel with the general commander of Southcom, how much are they really doing? That's for the drug cartels. And now for the political dictators, yesterday the ambassador for Venezuela said, we need a democratic transition in Venezuela. Really? Do you really believe Maduro is going to say, okay, I'm done? I don't want any power anymore. I'm going to go to Isla Margarita and sip margaritas for the rest of my life? Is it really possible to have a democratic transition in a place like Venezuela, in Nicaragua? Is it?
Okay, I thought that we were
And
speaking
both, the
about
question is for both.
censorship, websites blog, but we are here to speak about narco traffic. All right.
No,
the
thing
I'm
is
joking,
the
I'm
democratic backsliding and the freedom of speech.
I'm joking.
Who's doing it?
You know what?
We can
The nonviolent movement is the only movement that I can support, because once you use violence, maybe the solution is going to get worse than the problem itself that you're trying to solve. In the case of your question about if I think that Maduro is going to go like easily from power, I don't think he's going to go easily, but as a movement, social organizations movement, citizens movement, we cannot opt for anything else than non-violent, because violence only creates new problems and maybe bigger than the ones that we are facing right now. That's the first question. When you were addressing about the situation in Mexico, when drug cartels are the ones killing journalists, and maybe it's not the state, maybe it's not the presidency, all right, but the government, the state has a responsibility for action or omission. What that means is that if a journalist get like threats from cartels or from criminal groups, the state has the obligation to provide him with
But do
the
they have the
necessary-
capacity?
Maybe they have, maybe they don't, but there are mechanisms created to help journalists. The thing is, what Tamara was addressing, that they are not fast enough to help these people at the moment they need. That's one of the things that I struggled the most when I was being under attack in Venezuela. A group of lawyers were in my defense team trying to get like protection measures for the CIDH in my case, but if they don't see blood, they don't act as quick as they would.
If I could add to that, I think, there are different levels of government responsibility. I mean, obviously, when you have a government that is directly repressing a demonstration or jailing journalists, it's pretty clear cut.
Yeah.
You have other cases you were talking about omission, but you do have a responsibility to provide security to your people generally, and to ensure conditions in which you can exercise your right to free speech and the exercise of a free press. And that's where the government has the responsibility to provide protection. Whether they have the capacity and they're doing it right or wrong is a separate conversation that we need to have, and we need to figure out how to do that better. And I think a third point is, the government has a responsibility to ensure a situation in which that is conducive to freedom of speech and freedom of expression. And that's where many of these governments that are not dictatorships are failing. And you see that in Mexico, in El Salvador, in Brazil. It doesn't matter the ideology. You have leaders who go on TV and slam journalists because they don't like what they're
Costa
saying.
Rica just happened.
Yeah, they just don't like what journalists are saying, and then that's another big failure by governments in the region. So what do you do about this? And you were talking about the U.S. role. I think, to the extent that U.S. is paying attention to Latin America, they're paying attention because they care about migration, mostly as an internal policy issue. But you can't talk about migration in the United States if you don't look at two sides of the same coin. And the other side is country conditions in Central America, and Mexico, and Latin America that are forcing people to flee. And one of the ways that the US can help address these issues is by strengthening the rule of law in these countries. Yeah. And you can do that by helping support these mechanisms to protect journalists. You can do that by strengthening commissions to investigate corruption, like CICIG did in Guatemala, in your country, or other countries that have created mechanisms to strengthen the rule of law. That, I think, is a key role, Because as long as you don't have independence of the judiciary and a strong rule of law, all of these problems are going to continue because impunity is the rule in Latin America.
I agree, and the problem there, I guess, is first, like I told you, for me, it's two big problems, two different problems. The drug cartels is one issue that I don't know how much money they must have in Mexico, so it's maybe they even have more money than
the government itself.
Than the government itself. About the rule of law, I agree with you. The biggest problem that we have seen, for example, as you're saying in CICIG, in Guatemala, is when the people that are supposed to strengthen the rule of law and respect the due process and really try to strengthen the rule of law, they do it. They do like they did in Guatemala, the other thing. They do it totally different, and which is what they in Guatemala they at the end of the day they weakened the rule of law. So the problem with these commissions is that usually they do have ideologies, they have an agenda, and when that agenda becomes political, you destroy democracy and the Republican system, which is what happened in Guatemala. So, but maybe the question that I want to leave you, because we're running out of time here, and the question that I want to leave you is, I think there are two big issues: democratic elections, democratic leaders that get into government, that get democratically elected on the one side, which is one issue, and they love power and they want to stay in power, and they become dictators or wannabe dictators, like what's happening in El Salvador, for example, with Bukele. And then you have the drug cartels, which is this huge force with a lot of money, with no limits at all. There's no bills, there's no laws, there's no policies that are going to stop them because they don't respect those bills by nature. They are
by nature
on law. They're not law-abiding citizens. They're the opposite of law-abiding citizens by nature. So there's no laws that are going to apply to them ever. We need to approach both.
I would agree with that last point. I think it's important to address both if we want to ensure that, the topic of this conversation, right, that we avoid democratic backsliding and that we strengthen free speech and human rights. You need to tackle both. And I want to highlight the last point you said, is when you mix the politics with mechanisms to strengthen the rule of law, that's problematic. We can agree to disagree about the role of CICIG. I think they did a fantastic job, but I think
I'm sure they didn't.
Well, I mean,
I
think we can politely disagree on that one. But I think the point here is that it's extremely important that these mechanisms strengthen local capacity, because you don't want to have an international commission that comes in, does whatever work you think they're doing, and leave, and then you leave prosecutors having to deal with a very difficult context in a country like Guatemala or others in Central America or in the region. So, I mean, that's one point I think is important to highlight.
One of the things that governments like the US need to do about the situation of free speech, not only in Venezuela, in all Latin America, is consider all these crimes against free speech as bad as killing, as harassment, as kidnapping, as torture. We need to understand that democracy is not a unique thing that it sits by itself. Democracy is in the top of a stair, right? So you have one step is free speech, the other step is rule of law, the other step is due process. Everything conducts you to democracy. So if you don't have a protected free speech environment, you cannot live under a fully democracy. So the thing is, we have to protect and take in the same level the crimes against journalists and free media as on another, other political crime, crimes against humanity at the same level. That's the thing that countries like US can do.
I agree with you from the point of view that free speech is a God-given right that, like life, freedom, and property. But the problem is you cannot from the judiciary point of view, you cannot punish the same way somebody that kills another person as somebody that doesn't let somebody else talk. But I understand what you say. I understand. We need to wrap up. This is only 20 minutes.
It's about importance.
We need about 2 hours for this, or 2 days maybe. But thank you very much. This is like a glance of what we can talk about. And thank you, everybody. And hopefully we can keep talking about this.
I think it was a good example of freedom of speech, right?
Thank you.